Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final weekly debate of this academic year with the motion, this House would remove the UN Security Council's veto. So the first speaker of the night is Fiyin proposing. So whenever you're ready, Fiyin, I'll start your 5-minute timer.
Okay, ready. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to launch into my speech because fuck the rules and let's get rid of veto, right? So let's be clear. Veto is an undemocratic instrument wielded by the world's powers to their own advantage. I mean, how can the UN really say it grants the security and development of its member nations when 5 permanent members holding the veto power have time and again defied UN General Assembly decisions passed with an absolute majority? I have one point on which I'm going to unpack all my analysis, and that's basically the equality of nations, right? So the first bit of analysis for you today is having the veto breeds inequality and breeds a hierarchy. On our side of the house, we believe it creates a rat race or social climbs, and things that look like collaborations are really actually smaller nations bending to the will of stronger nations, which why wouldn't they, when inevitably they're at their mercy, they are at the mercy of this veto. We see no justice for the people and nations that any of the veto powers, the permanent ones, do not see as significant, or worse, unjustly and perhaps illegally see as their territory. We see under this motion, when we are able to remove the veto or keeping the veto, we see that like smaller nations are selling their soul to get the result they want. And it's not quite the friendly relation among nations that the UN proposes. The second bit of analysis for you is about how equality under veto dies a slow but sure death. The other side might say, well, veto should stay because there's no reason to take it away because, you know, these resolutions are almost non-binding. Then at their best, it does nothing. Nothing ever gets done. So what is the point of the UN except for a fancy dinner and an excuse to dress up? At worst, we have small nations compromising their values and sovereignty for the favor of one of the veto members or all of them, and the people who need the UN at most do not no longer have a voice. Also, what makes the readers, no, thank you. Also, what makes the leaders right, the right ones of these like nations that have the veto? There are other nations leading in social equality, provision of justice, and not least the corona pandemic effort that would possibly be way more qualified to have that veto power. Leaders change, the values of nations change, hostilities in the geopolitical sphere can escalate. And given those uncertainties, what is the justification of having this powerful tool in a body such as the UN? And secondly, leaving this kind of power in the hands of nations based on their past attitudes. From what we've experienced of the last 4 years, we know governments can change, we know the people in power can change. So why are we entrusting these nations in good faith based on past precedent to carry on? It's the future is not certain, ladies and gentlemen. As for the rotation of members on the Security Council, because I feel like they might bring that up, that, oh, other members get a taste of that power. Well, I would say like, on our side of the house, we find it rather patronizing that smaller nations or nations not deemed to be enough only get a taste of power and then get sent back to their seat for one. Many nations, especially in the African continent, are slowly but surely waking up to the reality that the change they want to see must come from them, not from Western or Eastern self-appointed powers. Now, we can have many charters, we can shake many hands, we can take as many photos as we want, but the fact is the existence of the veto gives us a true glimpse at the nature of the UN and the Security Council in particular. It silences the peoples, nations, and issues that any of the veto or all of them do not see as important. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the most important thing to take away is that under this veto, having this veto in place on the Security Council with those permanent members and even with the rotation of some countries onto the council, we still see that justice and equality die a slow but sure death. For all the reasons I propose to you and the people later down my bench will propose, please propose this motion. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Fiyin, for the opening speech of this evening. Now we move back to opposition. Opening the case is Eric. So Eric, whenever you're ready, I'll start your 5-minute timer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just quickly, if we would not regard the rules very highly, the whole debate would have been in jeopardy. This is why we really keep to the rules that we all agree. The point is that international system is a very complex system that is built around the notion of soft law. It's quite different from the useful regulations of the law where, okay, we'll write a law and then it applies to everyone. No, there are international agreements where the states might sign the treaties and declarations, but not necessarily follow the guidelines. Whereas ratification means that the state bound by the agreement and the only thing about the UN is that it is only the Security Council and ECOSOC that can write founding resolutions. Therefore, the UN is not useless in a sense. Also, the UN is basically the police of the whole world. In international law, the states commit to new regulations only if they wish so. There is no higher or more important player than the states themselves. The notion of the sovereignty that we all refer to quite often in the United Nations is the one that nobody can undermine. Only in the Security Council, they actually have the right to intervene and bring the peace and stability in the conflict, where the rights and lives are being abused. The Security Council consists of 15 members, where 10 based on the rotational basis, and 5 are permanent members with veto powers. In fact, veto power is usually the last resort by all means, where one of the P5 members feels the decision will undermine the international law or escalate the conflict, resulting in further disruption and lack of stability. It is hard to come up with one decision, one solution that will fill all of the marks and the outlines that the states would like to see. Therefore, it takes a long negotiation process to actually go and they bring the result into this stage. No, thank you, not at this point. And as we have said, because many states have different perspectives on conflicts and resolutions of it, the Security Council has to agree on measures of resolution. This is a very tedious process, and nobody's going to argue against that. But the Security Council can act only in extreme situations where the conflict is being out of control and gross norms of the international law are being violated. The Security Council is the only organ that is able to intervene in the conflict under fragile state of the international law. P5 are the most important international players in the world. You cannot deny that. P5 members represent 49% of the global economy, shared by just 5 of them, exerting a huge amount of influence around the globe, whether it is within the UN structure or not. The Security Council can impose international sanctions under Section 5 of the UN Charter. This is why P5's consent is necessary for political pressure. Now, let's imagine for a second that what would happen if one of the P5 members would not support the embargo or sanctions. The whole point of the economic measures would fall apart without those measures being agreed and not collaborated. The veto power helps the international community to instantly access how realistic and assess how realistic the sanctions will be. This is saving time on large-scale international arena that will make the states pursue and compromise straight away of the measures that can be taken. This will enforce the identification of common ground and structure of the measures to be taken. Secondly, the UN Security Council has most of the powerful militaries in the world. This would be Russia, UK, China, where it is important to keep the states actively working together. And if without that, we're risking proxy wars with the strongest military fighting against each other. It is vital to keep the rules the same, where the states can rely on each other and have the ability to negotiate the measures to be taken. In case we do not follow those guidelines, we're putting the whole international security into chaos, jeopardy, and uncertainty. It is in everyone's interest to keep P5 members with the powers they got. This is because they already agreed on an international system where everyone is accepting the norms. Furthermore, it is the interest of everyone to have the Security Council with its outlook to prevent larger breakout of conflict that may happen in between of them and protect ourselves from major escalations. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Eric, for opening the opposition side of the case. Now we move back to Gavin, who'll be speaking in second proposition for the motion. So whenever you're ready, I'll start a timer.
Thank you very much. It's a good attendance tonight, and obviously I think this is probably going to be my last speech in Debater. So thank you all for a pleasant 4 years. Fairly lively though. I just want to mention a couple of pieces of rebuttal from what Eric said. Eric mentioned about the veto powers. The thing is with the veto powers, yes, they are only used in certain instances, but the fact is that they have a lot more power on the permanent member states. Say a permanent member state, say the US, the UK want to do something, they know that Russia or China will veto that because of their national interest. Therefore, they won't even propose the thing at the UN Security Council because they know it will be vetoed anyway. So I think on that point, the opposition side is pretty weak. In terms of strong militaries interacting, which Eric suggests, strong militaries interact regardless. They haven't interacted rightly during the Cold War period, and that was a major problem, and the UN Security Council had a vital role then. But as I'm going to make in my points, I think the UN Security Council is outdated as it is, because international militaries, massive countries can interact at a phone call. I mean, how many people has Joe Biden spoken to since he became US president? Despite him barely walking out of the White House, he's been able to speak to practically any international leader that he wants. There's also a mention about how the UN Security Council is the only place in which peace and security is being brought. Well, I don't believe that's the case. You look at Yugoslavia, you look at Rwanda, you look at Iraq today, you look at Syria. These places, the UN Security Council has been woefully ineffectual at managing to stop these conflicts from getting out of control. My point is this, and I'll move on obviously to my main argument. It cannot operate in the same way in which we would have done in 1945. The world has changed significantly, and we must change with it. I won't take you just now, Robert. I'll perhaps take you later on. I'll make a bit of progress first. And as I say, in terms of Rwanda and Bosnia, the UNSC has been ineffectual. They have not proposed where you had UN peacekeepers who arrived pretty much when the genocide was at its conclusive stages. That is not a sign of an international organization which has any kind of good standing or good efficient progress. The veto power itself, it's exercised, of course, by the US, the UK, China, Russia, and the other one. You've got China and Russia, and they are the big disruptors in terms of this veto power. Russia has always been interested in its own national interest, and we've seen that go down a little bit at the end of the Soviet Union. There was a little bit more peacekeeping operations, but as I've said, in Bosnia and Rwanda, they were practically ineffectual, the UNSC, and they barely. By the time they got there, they were basically 5 minutes past midnight. So it wasn't a point. I'll take you, Robert. I'll take you now.
Yeah. Was that because of the veto specifically? If we remove the veto, will the UN suddenly become the perfect policeman for the world?
No, I think the problem was that the UNSC itself as an institution is ineffectual and it's inefficient. Now, you and I don't know every decision that is made behind the scenes at the UN. We see the UN veto be used, but we don't see the conversations that go on. And I would suspect, as I've said earlier, that when you consider how much power a veto power plays on every single 5 nations have to unanimously agree with something, it's very obvious to see that there were probably significant instances, and I'm not going to say it was significant, it was definitely the case in the 90s, but there's definitely been cases where very good motions have been proposed and they have not even gone to the table at the UNSC because they know that the veto power would mean that if nations were forced to, that they would vote against it or they would veto it. In terms of Russia itself, I think Russia has massive territorial ambitions. They've had that for a while. We know they've had that for a while. But in their proxies, does Russia want the US to be involved in Syria, in Iraq, 200 miles away from the Caucasus borders? Of course it doesn't. And it will vote against any kind of international action which goes against President Assad. They have allowed President Assad to gas his own civilians in Syria. They haven't bothered to launch a peacekeeping mission or support a peacekeeping mission in Syria or even in Iraq. They don't want to. It's a fact that's very, very clear. You see in China as well, how long have I got left? Oh, 10 seconds left. Well, all I'm going to say is on this, I think that the entire institution is out of date. I think we need a rethink. If the UN as an institution, if we were to treat it as a person, it would be 76 years old. And quite frankly, I think we need a rethink of the whole thing, but the UNSC in particular. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Gavin, for your final debater speech. Now we move back to opposition with Tane. So whenever you're ready, I'll start you with 5-minute time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to pick up briefly where Eric left off from. Keeping the UN Security Council veto is a vital aspect of international order, as it ensures that active engagement between powerful nations such as the US, China, and Russia is kept and maintained. For a world organization such as the UN to work within the framework of a nation-state model, which let's not forget we do, great powers must be allowed to participate in a way that protects their vital interests, or else it will fall into irrelevance. As simple as that. This therefore also raises a slight counterpoint to what the opposition was saying regarding the equality of nations. We don't live in a world where nations are equal. The international system is one of anarchy, so full equality, while wanted, is impossible, and thus we must look to the superpowers of this world for security. This lack of veto rights was a huge part of the downfall. Let's not forget as well, was a huge part of the downfall of the UN's precursor, the League of Nations. The US Congress specifically halted the US's entry into that institution because they lacked the veto. So let us not forget that the very purpose of the veto when the UN was formed was so that it kept and ensured the participation of countries like the US and USSR. Similarly, perhaps one of the main reasons why the UN survived up until today is because of the veto. During the Cold War, the Security Council was dominated, obviously, by pro-American, pro-Western forces. So if that was taken away and Russia was forced into, or at least pressured severely into adopting Western policies, surely they would have just withdrawn, as many did from the League of Nations. Also, to counter the opposition's point, security from the veto has been a force for peace and stability. For instance, and while there has been failures, there's also been massive decisive action, including maybe use of peacekeepers, to protect populations from atrocities and instabilities such as in the Ivory Coast, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Individuals have been referred to the International Criminal Court for committing war crimes, and peace agreements, even if temporary, are welcome and have been agreed upon, such as in Lebanon, which has saved countless lives. So the veto therefore allows the Security Council members to set aside many issues they may have, because obviously if we live in a world where there isn't a state of anarchy, if we let these forces clash all the time, it will only result in greater conflict. So while occasionally we may not be as progressive as we'd like, it prevents conflict on a massive scale and keeps countries crucially engaged with each other on many issues, whether that's just in negotiation objections and keeping them connected, or like I've raised just a second ago, they can lead to positive outcomes for maybe issues where they do agree upon. This intricate balance for international peace and security is therefore far superior to if no veto existed. Indeed, if we envision a world where no veto power existed, powerful nations such as Russia, China, and the US especially could heavily influence, more so than they do now, other members of the world order to validate their perception of contentious issues, such as maybe the annexation of Crimea, which and beyond the level that they are able to do currently. And that would exacerbate world tensions far more than it does now. And that would clearly be a huge threat to global peace and security, far more than current conditions. Again, to counter, thank you. Very briefly as well, another counter regarding the failure in Rwanda. The main point of the veto in the UN was to avoid world wars. And as horrible as this may sound, that's its purpose. So national or intra-wars are of lesser concern. This is because it works on a Hippocratic oath. So the decision shouldn't make matters worse. So the result is to not have a World War III. The Security Council's lack of action, just to finish off everyone, can indeed sometimes be frustrating and in result end in tragedy. Of course we know that, it's obvious. However, on balance, history has shown us that world order is kept far more secure by working through and with great powers rather than alienating them. And a withdrawal of the veto process will alienate those powers. So just to conclude, thus, ladies and gentlemen, I implore you to reject the notion of this debate, to abandon the veto of the UN Security Council, and instead for you to think regarding long-term negotiation processes and for peace. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Tane, for the opposition speech. Now we move back again to proposition with Marco. So whenever you're ready, I will start a 5-minute timer.
Thank you, everyone, and a very warm and wonderful evening to you all. So to kick my side of the argument off is that let's get down to brass tacks. The veto power in itself is undemocratic in nature. The entire reason for the creation of the United Nations is so that it can work as an international community, which it does on numerous occasions. If we look at it like this, the United Nations Security Council can easily, one single country can prevent a majority. For example, permanent members also veto resolutions that criticize their own actions, such as the 2014 annexion of Crimea by the Russian Federation. How is this acceptable? If you ask me, I don't think so. As well as the fact that the veto power is also exclusive only to the 5 permanent members. And honestly, that is anachronistic, really. We are living in the 21st century. Anachronisms should not be playing a role anymore. And I think the person who said that quite adequately was Peter Nadine. And I quote, "The veto is an anachronism. In the 21st century, the veto has come to be almost universally seen as disproportionate power and impediment to credible international action to crises." Guys, take that into consideration. If a man such as Peter Nadine can say that, why has no one else, especially countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France, not taken this into consideration? I mean, yes, I understand they are the 5 permanent members, but surely developed countries such as that should have taken that into account as well. After all, someone earlier in the discussion did mention, we are no longer our predecessor, the League of Nations. We cannot allow anything that happened in the 20th century to continue into the 21st century. Everything is developing, everything is moving forward. Why is this staying in a darker age, if you will? Because for what it's worth, the Cold War was a very dark age. People were sitting in a quiet little room, playing on a computer, thinking, how am I going to destroy my enemy? Ultimately, what I want to get down to is by adopting ARES 377A on 3rd of November 1950, over 2/3 of UN member states declared that according to the UN Charter, the permanent 5 of the UNSC cannot and should not prevent the United Nations General Assembly from taking any and all action necessary to restore international peace and security in cases where the UNSC has failed to exercise its primary responsibility for maintaining peace. Once again, if we look at an example of Rwanda, Bosnia, even such as Somalia, why has these 5 permanent members always had some or other say in order to basically withhold peace? An example, we are now going into 20 years where the United States has still not left Afghanistan. Give it 2 more years and we're going to be saying the same thing for Iraq. Yet the United Nations continues to allow their intervention, yet the war should have been over, according to them, by December of 2001, not December 2021. So I leave you with this. The veto power should be removed. It is an anachronism. We cannot tolerate it nor allow it to continue in a modern age where everything else has been allowed to develop, where we had no say in it. And this not, I don't think so. It is time for a change. I yield the rest of my time to the chair. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Marco, for the proposition speech. Now we're going to move back again to opposition with Gabi. So whenever you're ready, Gabi, I will start a 5-minute timer.
Yes, I'm ready. So yeah, to build up from my colleague speeches, what I want to say is that the veto power has always acted as a compromise, and it's a vital compromise. And also, not everything can move. The situation in the world currently, it may be looked like it is in standstill, but it can not only go forwards, but it can always devolve. It can also move backwards, and all the tensions, especially in current situation of COVID-19 pandemic, tensions can be aggravated. So veto power allows to keep one of those powers in check, and especially if one of the powers wanted to instigate a war or a military intervention, it potentially has the power to stop other country from moving forward with the war. And also, we're not saying that the current system the UN has is perfect. It's not all international systems, they are not inherently perfect, but they are working with something that has. And also, we're saying that the veto powers could potentially be modified, such as not allowing member states to allowing member states to vote only on certain veto only in certain questions. So there's always room for improvement. We see that and we consider that, and also all of the mentioned that some countries that Russia has national interest. The US also has national interest. And especially since the Second World War, like all countries have national interests, and we need to acknowledge that. And no country is innocent, but still, it's vital to keep veto power, because it is compromised that countries allowed for the system to be in the first place, as mentioned earlier. That we and like as I mentioned, as it can always devolve, it's necessary to keep the veto power. And I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabi, for the opposition speech. And now we move back to the final time for the whip speech from Jack Bogue for the side of proposition. So, Jack, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'm mainly going to talk a little bit about points of clash, which are to do with like the natural order of the United Nations. I'm going to talk a little bit about accountability, and talk a little bit about historical precedent. First, I'm going to engage in kind of just general rebuttal alongside the entire opposition bench. Okay, so one of the things that we need to, that they keep on talking about is the idea of like the idea that the P5 represent any form of great powers. Now, I have to there is very much a simple rebuke to this. Britain and France. Britain and France were definitely like big powers when in 1949, when the Security Council came up, when the Big Five, when the P5 started. However, they fucked it at the Suez Canal. Is the very simple answer, is that you cannot argue that at the moment that in particular the United Kingdom, I'm going to use full names, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Fifth French Republic are in any way powers on the scale of the United States, Russia, and China. What really is, what we talk about in terms of a big five is really a big three. No, thank you, not right now. Okay, so what is okay, so why is this bad? So one of the running arguments along the bench is the idea that it allows people to preserve power that they otherwise wouldn't have. So say for example, so part of the reason why these countries are as big as they are in terms of the current international system is because they were given this power at the start of 1949. At the start of when the Security Council was established in 1949. Now that is kind of so therefore that in many ways quite a lot of their power based on the international system is within this is purely because they have this veto. Yes, I will take you, Eric.
Thank you. Doesn't the speaker also recognize that in 2020 the P5 represents 49% of the global GDP? Doesn't the speaker absolutely ignores that the vast majority of the military power is shared by those 5 countries? Doesn't the speaker completely doesn't he
no
ignore
thank you, you've done your 15 seconds. Okay, so you've done your 15 seconds. I'm not going to take any more. Okay, so where okay, so again, you talk about like the thing of the P5 as a body, but how much of that P5 comes from 3 countries, and how much of that? So, say for example, like particularly large, and again, you get good examples like say India or Brazil are very much kind of big countries with big military presence and big military capabilities that actually aren't represented on this system because Britain and France be imperial powers that oppress people. That's kind of no thank you, Robert. I'm not going to be taking any more POIs throughout the rest of my speech. Okay, so next okay, so next, why are big countries likely to be shits, and why are they likely to protect their own interests in a at the UN Security Council? Okay, so say for example Russia as a power. So say for example Russia and the United States. Both of them have fucked about a bit with the world. Both of them have done shitty military invasions that the UN can't really do anything to stop, because they will innately veto anything that comes up against them. So, like you try to do anything when Russia's a shit in Ukraine, then Russia will naturally veto it. You try to like take unilateral action against Bashar al-Assad, Russia will inevitably veto it. If you try and take unilateral action against a shitty Latin American US puppet dictatorship, then naturally the United States are going to veto that, because that government being there is in the US's interests. Quite a lot of the bad faith acting that goes on throughout the world and throughout this international system is similarly the responsibility of these powers. So therefore, it's a little bit senseless to have a body that can actually do shit, but can only do shit with the approval of the countries that are doing things badly and fucking over the world. So that's so. Like for example, we keep on whenever they talk about like reform to the security, it's very innately just kind of works towards one side of the world. So for example, if you include the 3P5 plus the 2 rotating spots, 1/3 of the entire Security Council is inside the Western Europe and Others group, which is basically Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Greece, Turkey, and Israel. Now, that power as a bloc is innately very powerful and will naturally defend themselves if wrong. So what have I told you today? I've told you that it is unaccountable, and without the veto change, bad people will continue to be able to do bad things, and that is bad. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Jack, for the final proposition speech. I'd like to remind people about parliamentary language. Until then, we'll move on to Robert for the final speech of this evening. So, Robert, whenever you're ready, I will start a timer.
I really wish you hadn't reminded me about parliamentary language. Okay, right. Let's go. Okay, firstly, let's bring this debate back onto the topic. The topic is, should we remove the veto power? Not should we reform the UN Security Council? Like, we should reform the UN Security Council. India should be on there. Probably Nigeria and South Africa should be on there permanently. Probably also Brazil. Like, it's a mess. We know that. But that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about, if you have the current Security Council, are we safer with the veto power or without the veto power, right? Okay, so bearing that in mind, what have the other side brought us, really? They have brought us the idea that it's unaccountable, so these countries just get to do this and they don't have to hold up to democratic process, right? And they've brought us the idea that it's an anachronism. It's old stuff, bad, yeah, post-World War thing, right? And also we got out of Jack the idea that if you remove it, you would be able to intervene in more conflict, right? I'm going to tackle that last thing last because it feeds into the rest of what everything we said. But let's just quickly counter the unaccountable. I don't care. If it stops a war, that's what we're arguing. This will stop a world war, right? That's the crux of our argument. And if this stops a world war, it can be as undemocratic as it fucking wants, right? Because I don't care if we have to put all the power in the hands of one dude who just tells everyone where to go, so long as it stops several million people dying in nuclear holocaust, I'm great with it. You know? Secondly, anachronism, pretty much the same point. Like, yes, we acknowledge this needs reform, but right now there are very important powers like China and Russia and the US. And those three need this right now because those three are the most likely to cause conflict. As we see in Crimea, as we see in all the shit that China's doing, and as like US dictatorships or whatever, the US probably isn't going to start a world war. Well, not this decade. Well, not this presidency. Anyway, so, but that could change 20 years down the line. Don't we live in interesting times? So then what do we have? We have the idea that on our side, we have brought you that having this allows these large powers to control what the UN is doing. So they allow them to say the UN is not going to take action. And there's something I want to pick up in Jack's speech, because Jack's speech talked about what they prevented, right? And he prefaced, every time he said what they prevented, he prefaced it with unilateral action. He said it would prevent unilateral action in the Crimea, unilateral action in Syria, all these things. And that's important, right? Because it does prevent unilateral action, and that's important because unilateral action by one of these major powers is not what we want in this situation. That's the sort of thing that leads to conflict, because that is action which could mean that the other country needs a reaction, right? If it's taken unilaterally, if you're not making sure that the other countries are important with it. So say that America does decide that it wants to take unilateral action in Syria, and then Russia, because it hasn't had the opportunity to look at what that action is going to be and look at the consequences of that action, decides, well, I need to take action to stop this. There you have an escalating conflict zone. There you have a place where that turns from a small localized thing into a bigger thing between two major powers, right? And that's what we're trying to stop. We're trying to make sure that all of these small places, unilateral action cannot be taken, unilateral action which would lead to other countries making unilateral responses. We want all our action to be made with other things, right? And I think that's pretty clear, and I think we've argued that well, right? So they haven't given us much rebuttal to that. They've just said that like stopping these things would be bad, but we think the cost is worth it, right? We think that if you don't have this, you definitely get larger conflicts happening, right? So let's tackle a couple of like objections they could come up with that you might be thinking of, right? But nukes, so we're never going to get a world war, right? 2 points on this. Firstly, that hasn't stopped a lot of people dying hasn't stopped wars before. Secondly, Second World War, gas attacks didn't happen, right? I'm not sure if you're British, you've probably seen all the things, like kids went off to the countryside and they had their little box with their gas mask in it. But London never got gassed. Germany never used gas attacks on Britain. Why? Because they were feared of Britain doing the same, right? We have seen wars where large weapons of mass destruction have not been used because of the fear of it being used in reprisal, but conventional war has still happened. We believe this could happen again, and so we believe that things like the UN Security Council veto are absolutely necessary to preserve world peace. I hope you're happy with my timing, Jamie.
And thank you very much, Robert, for the final floor speech of this evening. So the way the second part of the debate works is floor speeches. These are 3 minutes in length in the order proposition, opposition, or abstention. Abstention is either for or against, or just a comment on how the debate went generally. So let's get to it. I'll start with the first proposition floor speech of this evening. If you raise your hand. If nobody wants to speak proposition, we'll move on to opposition. Anybody would like to speak in opposition to the motion? If not, then we'll do an abstention. Anybody wanting to... Beth. Okay, brilliant. I'll give you 3 minutes starting when you're ready.
Okay, so starting now. The proposition kind of turns this debate into a referendum of the UN in general. It wasn't specifically about the veto, although points specifically about the veto were raised. It was pretty much the ineffectiveness of the UN in general, in Rwanda and Yugoslavia in particular. But you could make the point that the veto is the symbol of the UN failing. It's the worst failure they could possibly do. So you then go to the opposition's arguments. Why are they saying that the veto is a good thing? Why we should keep it? A lot was mentioned about the UN surviving, how the veto was necessary to bring in the US to stop the USSR from leaving. But just because the UN is here doesn't mean it's doing a good job. It didn't stop the Rwandan genocide. It didn't stop the Yugoslav war from being absolutely horrible. So you have to wonder, is it actually doing what it intended to do? And then the argument was made that it doesn't stop small conflicts, it stops bigger conflicts. It stopped the nukes from flying, it stopped gas attacks. But you could argue that conflict has simply just changed. It's gone from big international conflicts to proxy wars between veto powers. You have Korea, you have Syria, you have other examples I can't think of off the top of my head. But it simply changed from the USA and Russia having their direct conflict to Russia funding North Korea, USA funding South Korea, Russia invading Crimea, and the UN can do nothing, its hands are tied. So you've seen that the UN can't really be effective even though it's there. So there's, what's the value of the UN? Is it just that it's better than nothing? Should we have a big international body stopping conflict, or should the very existence of nukes be enough? I mean, the UK is refunding Trident, like, is that a good thing? Is that going to stop conflict? Yeah, just because it's better than nothing doesn't mean it's a good thing. And that's my abstention speech.
Thank you very much, Beth, for that. Now we'll go back again. We'll do proposition, opposition, abstention. So who would like to speak in proposition for the motion? If you, Marco? Yeah, okay. Whenever you're ready, I'll start a 3-minute timer.
Right, thank you again. So just to re-solidify, I have heard everyone's both proposition and opposition, and I commend everyone for their noble views and the facts that have been very well and adequately stated. However, I am again of total reaffirmation that the veto power of the United Nations, as well as that of the Security Council, where I think it has been exercised on multiple and numerous occasions, no, pardon the alliteration or however you want to put it. Again, we are in the 21st century. Things have been allowed to develop. This has not, and I don't know why. I want to just quickly point out a few very interesting arguments. The United States and many other Western as well as Eastern countries were very pro boycotting the Republic of South Africa during the 20th century, as due to the very right-wing, also considered fascist regime of apartheid, which I agree. Boycotting a regime that oppresses a large majority of a country's citizens is completely wrong. However, when this issue was taken to the United Nations, nothing was done about it. And yet it was one of the most disgraceful civil rights violations in the world. People were literally stripped of the most basic human rights, while the other people in the country flourished, had the undeniable large amounts of wealth. Again, where was the veto power then? There was none. I take this as a good example. When it came to the United States, again, segregation, bus burnings, cross burnings, people being hung in the streets. And the US, again, UN veto power did nothing. So how can we honestly expect for something like this to continue if it hasn't actually made a meaningful impact? I leave that thought with you and I yield the rest of my time to the chair. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Marco. Okay, we'll now move to an opposition speech. Robert was first to have his hand up, so Robert, time, Eric.
So just to respond to what Marco said, and more generally to other points being raised, because I don't think the veto's existence needs to be justified in terms of what it can do, like what problems it can solve, right? Like you don't need to say, you can't use like Yugoslavia and say, well, Yugoslavia was bad and the UN didn't intervene, and so the veto is bad, without giving me the piece of linking saying that that was because of the veto. Like, did someone veto UN sanctions on South Africa? Like, was that the issue here? Or, because if not, then I don't see what the veto has to do with this particularly. Like, the UN can be an ineffective body and the veto still be useful within that ineffective body, if you see what I mean, right? The veto is not the entirety of UN operations, does not do the totality of what it does. So I think that comes with a lot of what Proposition was doing, was just spending a lot of time saying the UN doesn't do what we would like it to do, therefore let's change things. And they've never given us a particular reason why the veto is the thing that needs to change to make the difference, which is what they would have needed to do to win this debate.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the opposition speech. And now back to abstention. I'll go for Gabi, and then I'll go for you next time, Jack. That's all right. So, Gabi, whenever you're ready, I'll start your timer.
I'm ready. Like, I honestly, like, I spoke about opposition, but I have a mixed opinion on an issue. On one hand, I consider that it is, in a sense, undemocratic to have a veto power. And in some cases, for example, in the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth of Nations, it had actually caused the disruption of the union and disruption of the system, and it allowed foreign powers to intervene. But however, I think, like, in democratic sense, it has done wonders for the UN by allowing a dialogue of these big powers that it didn't do with the League of Nations. So this is why I have kind of very mixed perspective on thing. And also, like, in general, if we say one thing is democratic or not, what is democracy? What is democratic? And some things, they are socially constructed, and what is democracy? And it's usually determined by these big Western nations who have this power. And what they say that is democratic is not necessarily of democracy, because sometimes nations such as the US or UK or France do things that are totally not non-democratic, but they can get away with it, and that's an issue that would needs to be addressed by the UN, but it won't, because of how the UN works and how it tries to facilitate the dialogue, but at the same time, it makes changes impossible. So this is why I'm speaking in abstention.
Thank you very much for that abstention speech, Gabi. We'll go back again, starting at proposition. Anybody who'd like to propose the motion, please raise your hand now. Anybody opposing the motion? Please raise your hand now. Eric, when you're ready, Eric, I'll set a 3-minute.
Thank you. I should be ready for that. So first of all, I would like to point out that the point of the Security Council is not to bring democracy or anything. Well, is every single state in the world is elected democratically? Is this the universal value as well? So those are the questions for probably General Assembly resolutions and other committees that are specifically made for that. The Security Council, however, has been made specifically to protect the security of the world. So far, have we seen the breakout of the World War III? Well, to me, it is evident that it did not happen. What happened the last time? What happened just before the Second World War II? The breakup of the League of Nations. Basically, just adding 2 + 2, that gives me enough of an equation for this point. And we really need to be talking about specifically the veto powers, aren't we? And in this sense, the point of the veto powers is for the countries to actually look in what they're proposing to do, to negotiate and see what options they have on the table. If there is one option, for instance, let's put a case study. We all talked about Syria. Some countries wanted Assad to be gone. Some countries wanted to stay in power. But there is one fact that he was elected. Would Americans have a better say over the sovereign choice of people of Syria, for instance? It's a very thin ice, isn't it? So this is why the other countries had to step in and protect. But what would actually happen if, for instance, Russia would not? Well, the US would unilaterally go and intervene. What would that lead to? They're trying to assassinate Assad, and what consequences it would bring? For that, to me, it is very clear that the veto power is therefore a balance of big powers. This is something we need to think about, and let's not be fooled and be unrealistic with our ambitions and be too much idealistic. Veto powers is necessary for checks and balances on international interventions, what it is designed for. And so far, yes, sometimes it's inefficient, but it is working. And we need to be talking about how to reform the UN Security Council to increase its efficiency, but we need to retain the power of veto. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Eric, for that opposition speech. And now, final time tonight, abstention, which is Jack. So whenever you're ready, Jack, I'll start a timer. Parliamentary language, by the way.
Okay, don't worry. This is going to be a lot more mellow. I did that in competitive mode, and in competitive debating, swearing's fine. So that's so I think that the United Nations is of course it's like not it's problem of course it's problematic. Of course you have my problems with the veto are stuff like that. Are the kind of innately undemocratic stuff. The realities of it, at the very least, are that 3 out of the 5 countries kind of need it in order for them to participate within the international system. And realistically, you need the cooperation of the United States, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China in order to do anything. You need their cooperation, you need their thing. So I think what I do think is that, say, for example, the United Kingdom and France are obsolete, are like their particular use of the ability to have the veto power reflects an international world order that is innately colonial and is innately problematic. And as I mentioned in my speech, their position in the international order was gone within 10 years after the Suez Crisis. So I think that I think that it's true that the United Nations is undemocratic. It's probably true that the United Nations needs reform. Reform, the Security Council in particular, is a bit of an issue when it comes to like the stuff to do with like the regional blocks, who votes on where, this, that, the other, and the entire kind of politics behind that. So you probably do need a better way to operate the Security Council, and it probably means at the very least less countries with less countries with the veto. That's kind of my genuine solution, is that since the start of the thing, what has been like clearly the 5 biggest powers has the 3 biggest powers, and if you don't and you probably do need a shaking up of like who holds what power, who holds what kind of seat of permanence in the UN Security Council. However, so that means, so say for example, removing the ability of the United Kingdom, of France to sit there permanently and do their vetoes as like a legacy of their empire and their colonialism and their status in the international world order when it was established. And on the flip side of the coin, you need stuff like, say, you need kind of bigger power. You need bigger powers that are definitely more important in today's contemporary world. That need to have more of a voice. I cited, say, for example, Brazil, India, South Africa in my speeches, like as powers that are as important powers that are underrepresented in the current system, which is a hangover of the imperial past. So in an ideal world, you need to get rid of the veto. However, in a kind of practical sense, you need 3 countries specifically to retain the veto in order for them to cooperate in the international system and to make it work. That's the United States, Russia, and China. So partially scrap the veto is basically my answer.
And thank you very much, Jack, for the final floor speech of this evening. So now we'll move on to the vote. The way we vote in this house is by raising a hand or writing in the side chat or putting an emoji on your reaction. So all those in favor of the motion, this house would remove the UN Security Council veto. Please raise your hand or react now. Thank you very much. And all those opposing the motion, this house would not remove the UN Security Council. Thank you very much. Oh, very close. I don't normally read out the scores, but I will. With 6 in proposition and 7 in opposition, this house would not remove the UN Security Council veto. Thank you very much to MUN for coming along to this evening. It's been really great to have you. Hopefully we can do more collaborations next year. Check out their crisis happening in April on their Facebook page. Check out our El Marshall event, which will be happening on the 26th of March 2021 at 7 p.m. Speakers will be announced through the week. Until then, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. It was really fun. Well done, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thanks,
It was nice.
Thanks, guys.
See you at your next event.
Friday, 7 o'clock.
I've been playing what's called Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time in my PS2 this whole event, and it's been great.
That's great.